Hey, we're live. Welcome to tutorials for not developers. Tutorials for not developers. This comes at a ironic time because YouTube just updated a pretty big part of their streamer UI. And so I had to figure it out just now. So maybe I'll show that as an example. It's a pretty good idea. I wish I had taken a before shot now, because now I only have the after. But obviously streamers are not developers, as are most of the users of your software. Most people who will use your software are not going to be developers. So why do I call it professional cat herding? Why is it that tutorials are a lot like herding cats? Well, it's very difficult to get them to do what you want them to do. It's very difficult to get them to learn what you want them to learn. It's pretty difficult to get you guys to learn anything, and you're paying for the privilege. Your customer, on the other hand, they actually don't want to learn as much as possible. In fact, they're paying you for the privilege to not learn. They want software that is as easy to use as possible. So when you present your customer a piece of software and it requires a tutorial, boy, they don't like that at all very much. Now, on the other hand, there is an entire industry of people who do nothing but tutorials, training, that sort of thing. They actually don't write any software. And there are also big software industries. I'm going to use SAP as the example. No hate on them. Okay, SAP is the software that is used for the general management of the business in almost, I think it's the majority of Fortune 500s. If it's not like 80-90%, I'd be surprised. SAP runs their inventory, shipping, receiving, order fulfillment, billing, all of that stuff. Now, there are lots of different kinds of companies out there. So SAP is this unwieldy, incredibly complex, very difficult to configure tool. And when you buy SAP, part of what you pay for in the many, many millions of dollars that you're going to end up paying most likely is for them to come down to your facility, train your people, write tutorials for you, show you how to do these different things. So after they configure this gigantic monolith that is SAP for your organization, they need to explain to you, all right, how do I make a purchase order? How do I accept a purchase order? How do I accept a shipment? How do I change the number of items that was sent in delivery after the delivery guy realized that he left 2 boxes on the dock? All of this stuff ends up becoming a process. All of these processes end up requiring a tutorial. This is actually where they make the big bucks. The software itself it's something, okay? And a lot of these enterprise softwares are that way. The software itself, that's one part of the industry. Explaining to people how to use it, it's a whole nother part of the industry, a whole different revenue stream. So not only are tutorials sometimes for people like you and I, free, accessible for using the software that we got, probably for free as well, there's also a whole industry of tutorial making and training and all of the different elements of teaching not developers to use these complicated enterprise products. And you might say, well, all right, why don't we just write easier enterprise products? Well, people have been trying for decades and it just hasn't caught on. There's a certain element in enterprise that really doesn't like easy to use products. This is also why you'll see Slack a lot more often than, say, Discord. So Discord is Slack's easier to use younger cousin, but Slack is still vastly more popular. Now, Slack has a couple of features that Discord doesn't, particularly in admin. You can definitely have more control over, like, you can see the logs and things like that. Whereas Discord, even if you're the administrator of a server, you're not really its true admin. You can't actually do anything there except basically boot people out and control messages. So there are some feature differentiations too, but broadly, enterprises use Slack because Slack is more enterprise looking, right? Discord's too playful, too fun. It's got little jokes in it. It's too easy, right? It just doesn't look like an enterprise product. It's the same reason that a lot of organizations stick with things like Excel and Word and all these different things. They feel enterprisey. They have all these menus and sub-menus and sub-sub-menus. That's what enterprise feels like. It feels like sub-menus and lots of context buttons and things like that. And so basically every enterprise application comes with its manual, its bevy of tutorials on how to do every different little thing. And people get paid to write those. People get paid a lot to write those. But oftentimes not enough. And sometimes they co-opt developers who are not supposed to really be writing tutorials into doing it. And other times, worse yet, they hire specific tutorial writers, people who are paid to do this, and then you, the developer, must explain to them how things work. A lot of the manuals and tutorials you read are written by professional writing contractors, and generally speaking, these are not the same people who made the thing, and sometimes they have no interaction with the team that did make the thing. That usually gets you into a very difficult and unfortunate situation. So, there you go. Tutorials. Let's begin. By the way, tutorial is not a manual. It's not an instruction manual, but it is very similar in concept. Tutorial is almost like a snippet of an instruction manual, or one piece of an instruction manual. Or you can consider an instruction manual to just be a long-form tutorial with extra details. So who are non-developers, first of all? Well, okay. A lot of non-developers are average people, and we all know about average people. Famous line from George Carlin. Think about how stupid the average person is, and then realize that half of them are stupider than that. Right. So you guys have been in the university bubble for a while, and one way or another, the university bubble is not average people. The people you interact with on a day-to-day basis are cleverer than average. And so I think that especially amongst fresh university graduates or people who are simply locked in industry and don't interact much outside of their bubble, they have a tendency to severely overestimate the average person, especially the average person's patience. Because when you are particularly good at reading and cognitive activities, you have the ability to read stuff quickly, and so you tend to process more text, you tend to process more information faster. When somebody processes information slower, something that is not at all frustrating to you can become very frustrating to them. And most people fall into this category of barely literate. There was basically a peak literacy in the 20th century or so, when pretty much everybody could read. Newspapers were common. People read large bodies of text. Now, people read short snippets of text. People don't like reading long things, 240 characters or less. There were a lot of people that complained when they raised the character limit on Twitter. That should give you an example of how much anxiety people get from reading long snippets of text. Reading text, this is, by the way, a total guesstimate, but reading text over one paragraph can yield anxiety in a lot of people, and people avoid what makes them anxious. And their coping strategy is to say, too long, didn't read, and skip away from it. There are other coping strategies, we'll look at them in a sec, but you really don't want people to have to cope with your tutorial. You want to write a tutorial that is informative and that people are able to read without turning anxious. So a lot of what you want to think about when you're writing a tutorial is, will this portion that I've written cause my average target audience anxiety? Now, you're not always writing tutorials for average people. In fact, just the ability to use the computer and use software already marks your population at slightly above population average, right? Because it selects away from a large body of the population that can't even do those things. So you've already selected to an extent for a slightly above average people, and then you'll probably select even further. So if you're writing a software for, let's say, lawyers are typically more intelligent than your average bear, so you probably don't need to assume that they're barely literate. On the other hand, they have no tech skills exceeding what the normal population would have, right? So in that case, your audience is one that is literate but not technically literate. They don't have any technological talents. If you're writing something for IT, well, those people are very technically literate and also, broadly speaking, not very patient. And so that tutorial is going to lean on the lower end of literacy and the higher end of technical literacy. You definitely have to know your audience. But don't think that you're designing things for the average person every time. But do remember that you're designing things for at least the average person in the audience that you have. And I think all of you, for your senior design project, have a pretty decent idea of what your audience is. So for most of you, it's either technically talented people. So definitely for the online education thing, you guys are dealing with people who are technically savvy enough to deploy their own content already. And then the rest of you are looking at enterprise products with people who have pretty much no technical talent, but they're familiar with a suite of tools, for example, Google Suite. But they probably also, like most people, lack patience, and so you probably would err on the side of less literacy, so fewer words. Too much information, TMI, right? That's what you really want to avoid. The common tutorial, a tutorial for normal people, that has even more so than a tutorial for developers, so compared against a tutorial for developers, there's an even greater balance of providing information versus reducing information. So you want to give them all they need, but you don't want to give them any more, because otherwise you'll give them TMI. And when people are confronted with TMI, these are their most typical coping reflexes. So first, they'll try to take the path of least resistance in order to make it through your content if they feel that it's important. So one thing that they might do is skim, or they might look at only the pictures and the figures, or they might look at only the first and last sentences of each paragraph. These are things that you've probably seen yourself do when you encounter a text that is too long. They might go run to the Cliff Notes if those are available, but they're probably not for a tutorial. If there's a TLDR, people will often skip to it. So providing a TLDR is not always a bad thing if you think that it's possible to gain that information from it. Some people will just give it a go without reading the tutorial, though. This can be pretty disastrous depending on how your software works, what you do. So don't assume that people have read the manual. We used to have an expression that was very popular, RTFM. People don't say RTFM anymore because nobody really RTFMs. RTFM stands for Read the Manual. Yeah, you probably know what the F stands for. So most people don't RTM anymore, and that's kind of the expectation. So if you're overloaded with TMI and you decide to read the whole thing from start to finish, and it's just beyond your cognitive abilities, which is not to say that you're dumb, it's to say that the text is too complicated, number one. Number two, it might be too complicated for you. Or perhaps, yes, you are too dumb, but there are many reasons that you might not be able to process a paragraph or a tutorial full of information. And if you can't process it, if you get overloaded, then you essentially retain nothing. So when you're confronted with too much information, even if there was something there that could have been retained if it was extracted, so if it was made shorter, just simply by omitting some of the content, you might have gotten the reader, to maintain some of that info. What often ends up happening if you overload your reader is that they retain nothing. So they actually retain less than if you had given them less information. So try not to overload people, or their brain just turns into memory-based mush, and you get nothing. And the worst thing that people can do if you confront them with TMI is that they withdraw entirely from participation. So they'll simply stop participating in your tutorial or whatever, and in that case what that usually means is that you've lost a user. So they stop participating in your software. You don't have them engaged in your software anymore. That's often what will happen. If somebody withdraws from your tutorial early on, it probably means that they don't know how to use your software, which means they're going to give it a crack, and then they're going to fail at it, and when they fail at it, they will just go do something else. And this is true even for your senior design projects. If you create a wonderful piece of software that does everything it's supposed to do for the organization that you're making it for, and then you write a crappy tutorial for it that has too much information, and the people that you deliver it to simply can't process it, it overloads them, or they decide to withdraw because they simply don't want to read all of that text. Well, even if you made a wonderful piece of software, it'll get thrown in the trash. And that's a bit of a tragedy, right? Especially if you worked hard on it. So try not to let your hard work go to waste. Focus at least enough on your tutorial that your work can be used by others. So here we want to talk about the concept of minimalism. And I'll probably talk about minimalism again a few times in other avenues, other domains, but I think it's no more important anywhere else than it is in tutorials. And the concept of minimalism is very well defined in this quote by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. My French is very good. You can tell I have lots of accents. So perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. All right, Antoine, let's prove it. What can we take away from this quote to keep its meaning? What can we remove? What words can we omit from this quote without making it lose its meaning? Can anybody think of a word we can remove from Antoine's quote to make him look like a big fat hypocrite? What can we remove from what is otherwise, I think, a perfect summary of minimalism in either chat? Anybody got any ideas on what we could strip away here? It's hard, right? Pretty much everything there is necessary. Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. I guess we could get rid of the but that kind of reduces the meaning, doesn't it? We could make it theirs instead of there is. It doesn't really save us any space. It's minimalistic. Wonderful. So provide the least information that your user needs to attain understanding. And again, more than other mediums, tutorials lean towards preferring minimalism over complexity. There's always a big debate over minimalism versus complexity. Some people say that maximalism is the opposite of minimalism. Maximalism is overusing your space, having excess, having a lot of stuff, right? Let's see, I got one answer. Perfection is achieved when there is nothing left to take away. There we go. This is a common rephrasing, actually, of this same quote. Perfection is achieved when there's nothing left to take away. So a little hyperbole, a little hypocritical minimalism there in terms of using the longer expression, right? So the alternative there. Perfection is achieved when there's nothing left to take away. And you can make that even shorter if you want. So keep going. Be as minimalistic as you can. Yes, the opposite of minimalism is not really maximalism, it's complexity or adding more information. The opposite of this is that perfection is achieved when there's nothing more to add. That's maximalism. So the literal opposite of it is maximalism, but the philosophical opposite is more like complexity. It's add as much as is needed, add as much as you can, add as much as is relevant. Typically, tutorials will follow minimalism instead of that philosophy, instead of the philosophy of complexity. Okay. So the biggest cop-out in making a tutorial is just not to have one. That's always the biggest cop-out, right? And a lot of software doesn't have one. In fact, probably most of the software you use doesn't have a tutorial. That's because convenience does sell. And a lot of softwares have become successful simply because they didn't need to have a tutorial. So Discord is a big example in this domain. Most of you probably don't remember the Ventrilo and TeamSpeak days, and even before that, the wave of failures that preceded them. in the Ventrilo and TeamSpeak days, using your voice chat was pretty hard compared to Discord now. The friction was pretty high. This also predates Skype, for example. Skype slightly reduced the friction. So Skype actually won on convenience before Discord overthrew Skype on convenience. So in those days, you had to download the software, go to connect, enter the target's IP or server DNS. You might have had to change a port too occasionally. Then you had to hit connect. You had to have a username. You had to have a password. It's very complicated compared to Discord, which is just, I hit link, I click mouse, right? No tutorial is needed for Discord. It is by far more usable than the previous alternatives, as Ventrilo and TeamSpeak eventually yielded to Mumble because Mumble was easier to use, and then eventually Mumble yielded to things like Skype for most use cases, because Skype was even easier to use. You just installed the app, added people to your friends list, and called them, and then Discord beat them all by simply requiring a link. And for most of the features, Discord continues to maintain that ethos of not needing a tutorial. It's very easy. If you want to share a file, you drag and drop it. That's pretty obvious. You want to share a picture, you drag and drop it. That's pretty obvious. There's a text box you can type in. That's pretty obvious. Now, that simplicity of the big use cases, if you really look into Discord's usability, it leads to a pretty interesting complexity model for the hard use cases. So like DMing people is not really that easy. It's not obvious. And something like finding your DM with somebody. So let's say that I sent a message to somebody a few days ago and I closed it. So how do you find a message you sent to somebody a few days ago in Discord? It's actually not that simple. Right? It was simpler in other applications than it is in Discord, because Discord doesn't prioritize those less useful, less common use cases. That's one of the ways you can reach no tutorial, is by making the most common use cases front and center, making them incredibly easy to use, and then burying everything else in the submenus so that they are more difficult to use because they are not visible. They don't distract the user from those important tasks that you did need to make usable. So you make all of the easiest and most important tasks extremely usable at the expense of making all of the less common tasks more difficult and less visible. And that's not a bad thing. The task that I just asked you to do, the whole figure out what you sent in DM 3 days ago, is not that complicated. You find them in your friends list, right-click on them, and go to message. It's just not something that's necessarily as intuitive as everything else on the platform. A lot of the stuff on the administration side is like that too. How do I make a channel? How do I change the permissions on the channel? It requires you to navigate a pretty long series of submenus. There's nothing wrong with making the difficult stuff, the configuration stuff. So for a lot of your applications, the whole administration of it, adding items, removing items, changing your lists, updating your spreadsheets, updating your database, there's nothing wrong with making that stuff complicated. That stuff maybe even requires a tutorial. You can still prioritize no tutorial for your most common, most average cases. There's also models like iOS. So iOS as a Unix-based system, it's not even comparable to Linux. I mean, it's so much easier to use iOS than it is to use Linux. And this includes variants like Android. So iOS versus Android, no contest. iOS obliterates Android. If you've ever given both of those models to the elderly, you'll know there's no contest. For people who have never used a phone before, it's absolutely iOS all the way. But again, that means that a lot of the stuff that was more complicated, iOS's version of that is different from Discord's. It's just block it out completely. There's no submenu to do a wide variety of things in iOS. You just can't do it. That's just the answer. Just, oh, you can't do that. Like, how do I install another app store? Just don't. Oh, okay. Well, that solves that then. All right. So in order to make a no tutorial piece of software, you really need to have extensive knowledge of user interface, or just intuition. A lot of people just have a really good intuition for user interface. It's something they say of people like Steve Jobs, that he just had amazing intuition for thinking like the user. But if you think you have it, you probably don't. Most people don't. There's a tendency among software developers to write things and say, it's so obvious, no tutorial is needed. And they're wrong probably 95% of the time. So if you think you don't need a tutorial, you're probably wrong. It's probably more complicated than you think. So I would always recommend you try your stuff out on an average user before you decide that no tutorial is needed, because you're almost certainly incorrect. It doesn't have to be long. Give it to somebody for 5 minutes and you'll immediately see how dumb you were for thinking that no guide was necessary. So this requires you to have super shoshin. Remember the beginner's mind? If you have no tutorial, you need the beginner's mind on steroids. You need to learn how to think not like a beginner, but like a complete beginner, like a complete idiot, like someone who has no comprehension of the world, like a little infant, newly born. You don't have language or dexterity. I'm exaggerating a little, but really you need to be able to think like anyone. That's the biggest thing. And so you need to be able to think like all the different variants of beginner that there can be, because there's one avenue of Shoshin, which is to think like yourself as a beginner, and that's the easiest, of course. You can recollect what it's like to be a beginner, but there are different kinds of beginners too. Even you as a beginner come from a place of having a undergraduate education in computer science and all of that stuff. It's very difficult to think like all possible variants of the beginner using your application. I've never used computers before person, the expert in computers person, all these different people that have never used it before all have very different experiences as beginners. There are many things in common with them, but they are still different. And learning to think like a complete fool is very hard. So learning to think like somebody who's almost deliberately trying to not make your thing work is very difficult. And then what's it like to be colorblind or dyslexic or illiterate or have uncorrected hyperopia, which is just you can't see things up close, right? That's farsightedness. So you squint when you look at things that are too close, so screens. Now, if you combine those things together, that's at least 10% of the population there, people who have one of those 4 conditions. So colorblindness is about 8% of males. You've got dyslexia, which is some single digits of the whole population. Illiteracy, you got about 1% even in America. And then you've got your uncorrected hyperopia. The data on how many people don't wear their glasses is unclear, but you're definitely looking at least single, maybe double digits of people who don't have their glasses on them when they're first trying to use your application. Not mentioning the people who are too stubborn to wear them. So it's hard to think like all of these different people, right? And this is what you would have to do in order to achieve no tutorial. So I would not recommend trying it at this point in your careers, although you can try to think about how you might accomplish it. At this point, I would say focus on making the best UI you can, but don't assume that you can make a UI that's so intuitive that people can use it without any explanation whatsoever, because you probably can't. Which brings us to the next best thing, which is basically to make a picture book. So pictures tell 1,000 words. Everybody has heard that expression. It is psychologically true that people extract more information from images than they do from other mediums. The brain is dedicating a very large space in terms of its overall size. A pretty big chunk of your brain is dedicated to visual processing. So that tells you a lot about where nature made its priorities for people, when something like a quarter of the whole thing is just for figuring out what's going on in your eyeballs. So typically when users are faced with TMI, one of their first responses is to jump to the pictures or the figures or whatever it happens to be and just look at those. And that's a pretty natural and also very practical response, because the pictures have the highest information density usually. They can communicate the info to you as quickly as possible. They have a lot of bandwidth. And they also have the most info there per the time that you spend on them, so per second that you spend looking at them. There's almost no too long didn't read phenomenon for images. You can almost scale this indefinitely. You can make tutorials of dozens and dozens of images, and people generally still bear with it. They won't try to skip ahead too much. There are obviously upper limits there eventually. If you had a tutorial of 100 images, I think you probably would wear out most people's patience. But if you include as many as is reasonable, generally speaking, they will not skip. They will look at them sequentially, or at least if they skip, they will skip as is relevant to them. So don't be afraid to pack in almost as many images as you can. In fact, if it's possible, I suggest that you visually lay out the whole process that you're trying to describe from start to finish. So go through it and go one shot at a time. There is an annoying tendency, I find, in picture-based tutorials to do something like this. They'll show you, click on File, and it'll show you the submenu of File open. And now go to Page Setup. Okay, if I see Page Setup in File's submenu, then your tutorial is fine. If I have to access another submenu in order to see it, then you should show me a picture of both of those submenus exposed. So if I have to go to File, Page Setup, well, you should show me that. You should show me that page is open, and then I have to go to Page Setup. So don't substitute showing the entire thing visually by interlacing text, because many people will simply skip your text, or they'll have to go back to your text, which can become frustrating. So if the process is actually File, Page Setup, show File, the page submenu, and Page Setup visually, without saying in the text, go to File, Page Setup. It's obvious in the text, and people should read it, but they often don't. So even for more complicated tasks, make sure you lay out the whole thing visually, if it's possible. Sometimes it's really difficult to capture those intermediate steps. So don't forget your trusty print screen button. You can generally mash that thing. You can always resort to recording your screen and pulling out frames too, if that's easier for you. But you'll usually get a drop in visual quality when you do that. Okay, storytelling. Some people like storytelling in their tutorials, some people don't. Let's take a poll. I'm going to do it in the in-class chat. Do you like it when people tell stories in their tutorials? So stories are like, when I was 5, I once used Microsoft Word, and it was wonderful. That's a crappy story, right? Okay, well, I think that this tends to be the ethos of software people, that they tend to reject tutorial. Yeah, the legend of the crystal berry, somebody said, right? When I was 5 years old, I once opened up Microsoft Word, and I still remember that day today. That's not a very good story. That's not an interesting story, and it's not a hook. And software developers, I would say, as an audience, are broadly apathetic to storytelling. I think it's years of being trained to read uninteresting documentation and stack exchanges and stuff. If you were trying to read how to do something technical, and they started with a story, you would be quite frustrated, and that's probably true. But at the same time, every single recipe on the internet starts with this, right? It starts with, my gran once made this, or we cooked this in 48 hours last Tuesday in Spoken Oak, and it was so delicious, and the whole family loved it. So all those different kinds of tutorials, the ones for normal people, storytelling is very common in those. And so I would say that among your average non-developer person, it's probably closer to 50-50 in terms of whether it's adored or frustrating. A lot of that also plays into search engine optimization and making your content long enough for technical reasons, making it unique enough for technical reasons, but some of it is actually not dark pattern nonsense. Some of it is actually storytelling for storytelling's sake. For software, there are plenty of interesting stories you can tell too, unlike the ones I used Microsoft Word thing. So you want to remember that the fastest path to engaging users is to build tension. This is true of storytelling in general. The more you build tension, the more the reader wants the tension to be resolved. And when you want tension to be resolved, you continue reading in order to see how it gets resolved. So if you have a story that you're trying to tell, first, lead with an example that builds up tension, like once I tried to run both of these things at the same time in production. That ended up costing me a few weekends. Don't. and now you can explain how it ended up costing you a few weekends. This is a crappy story that I sort of abbreviated. The better story would be that you build it up, that you lead with that you're random in production, and then you slowly discover how much you messed up and how bad everything is, and then you introduce the user to what they were supposed to do correctly by demonstrating the extent of your mistake. Those kinds of things can be very useful. But it's really difficult to do that kind of storytelling. It's kind of a creative writing exercise that most people probably aren't very good at since they don't practice it very often, and it's kind of a niche talent to begin with. So avoid it if you're not good at it, but if you think you're already good at it, it might be something to consider. You can hook people in with a tense and interesting story related to the activity that you're trying to describe. Video. Let's do another poll. Let's see how many people prefer video tutorials. You will prefer video tutorials over text. Whoops. Yep, you only get one option on this one. You can only vote for video. What did I miss? Parenthesis. There we go. So prefer video over text. Text including pictures and all that stuff. I find that a lot of people prefer videos in the YouTube generation. So people who were raised watching a lot of YouTube, or people who were raised watching a lot of videos in general. I think those of us who grew up with television probably trust video a little less. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Let's say the biggest con of watching videos on the internet if you're not a developer is you probably haven't yet discovered adblock. But the biggest pro is that videos are really easy to produce quickly. You can just record yourself doing something and call it a day. Like, oh, this is okay. How to use my app. Watch, I'm going to do it. Boom. I finished it. Someone said YouTube for the hover over timestamp. So this is not necessarily a replacement for actually having a table of contents. Like someone else argued, text, you can search. Control F is a very powerful, very useful thing, and a table of contents even more so. Now, some video editors will go through the very nice extra step of writing for you a nice table of contents, what time we do everything at. First of all, that's rare. Second of all, that's a lot of work. That adds a lot to your production value. So that gets rid of your biggest pro, which is that video you can crank out much faster than any other kind of tutorial today. There are so many different softwares for recording your screen. One usually comes with your graphics card if you don't have one integrator into your CPU. If you bought a discrete graphics card, you have one right there in your driver that can record video and audio. You could knock out a video showing how to use your application in 30 minutes, and it would have most of the coverage that is necessary. So you would probably be able to cover all the common use cases real fast, whereas typing that out could take you hours, and taking screenshots of it and including those take you even more hours. So it's not to say that video is a bad thing. Certainly when you're pressed for time, it's not so bad. Some people in enterprise would be upset if you had relatively low production value, so they'd probably expect a little bit more than you just recording your screen and showing how you use it. That's not always the case. Enterprise tutorials actually do tend to have pretty bad production value. Most people, when they think of an enterprise tutorial or something, they think of HR's discrimination seminar with its hilariously underpaid actors and everything. So if you're thinking of that kind of thing and applying it to the software world with all of its underpaid actors, then yes, probably the same thing. I think back, whenever I think of enterprise tutorials, I think back to Jennifer Aniston and Matthew Perry explaining Windows 95 to the world, which if you haven't seen is comedy gold, so at least give that a look. It's probably the most wonderful tutorial of that generation. Coming off their success in Friends, they did a basically tutorial for Microsoft. I think it's Windows 95. But those kinds of videos have higher production values. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about easy to produce quickly. I'm talking about the bare minimum, which is that if you really needed to show somebody how to do something and you need to do it as quickly as possible, you would probably just share your screen, right? And so video derives largely from that. That also means that it's really difficult to find stuff in that video if you're watching it later. Many activities are best explained by video. Anything physical is obviously best explained by video for the most part. So how to fix something, how to build something, how to do some neat trick, how to craft some neat thing, any of that stuff. How to do the ice bucket challenge, all that stuff is best explained by video. If you try to explain that in text or even in pictures, it's just confusing most of the time. That's why IKEA instruction manuals are so frustrating, right? Because it would have been easier if they just did a video. They wouldn't have to pay somebody to write an instruction manual if they just did a video. But what's wrong with having a video of IKEA instruction manuals? I'm sure everybody has assembled IKEA furniture or similar. If you haven't, you're missing a crucial life experience. You need to get yourself to an IKEA as quickly as possible. But what's wrong with a video? Why doesn't IKEA do video instructions? What would be wrong with watching a video and following along with that? What's the main downside? This is the same main downside that a lot of software has. It's the same reason that video is terrible for explaining software. It's the same reason that it's terrible for explaining how to put together your IKEA furniture. All right, anyone that's ever put together IKEA furniture knows that there are 9 pieces, and they are all extremely similar in appearance. Someone said it takes a long time, and pausing and the like. There's that. Got to pause and rewind, and that's annoying. But when you get your IKEA furniture, you're building a table, you get like 9 pieces, and they're all extremely similar in appearance. The only difference between them is that one has a little notch at the top, and the other has a little notch on the side, something like that. One of them takes a peg, one of them takes a screw. Otherwise, they look nearly identical, right? In a video, stuff moves fast. It's very hard to differentiate. Is this the one with the notch? Is this the one with the side notch? Is this the one with the peg? Is this the one with the screw? When they write the manual, what do? They highlight it. They put a big box around it, and they show you, this is the piece with the notch that goes onto the piece with the peg. Okay, and they demonstrate, they very clearly bold it and highlight where the notches are supposed to be, where everything goes. Most people following that instruction manual still manage to mess it up just because it's very complicated, so it's obviously not a perfect process. But if you were following along with the video, they would have to stop on every piece and point out and go, this is the piece with the notch on it, and it goes here into the peg, and it would still be complicated. Whereas with the picture, you can lay it out and literally compare it against the picture and sort of look back and forth in real life. And that's why the visual picture manual is much more preferable in that case. And just like software manuals, many at least, IKEA manuals have no words. They have nothing, no words. Sometimes they'll have a warning of some kind, but generally they're all pictures. And good software manuals, I think, are also pretty much all pictures. So try to learn those couple things from the IKEA manual. Those little subtle pieces of information that are very easy to overlook in video are the main downside to video, is that the information can be so subtle that it's easily missed and require multiple rewinds and rewatches before it's picked up. Or worse yet, they build it wrong, or in your software's case, they do it wrong and have to undo all these different steps and go back through them. But some software is super visual and super information dense, so video is kind of the only way it's even possible to digest it. I would Blender and CAD into these categories. If you've ever tried to read a Blender tutorial, you've probably found it unbelievably useless, because Blender is so complicated and it has so many menus and submenus and insanities that it's just information overload just from the moment you open it. So the better solution is don't get that dense. Keep your software at a relatively digestible state so that you don't end up in the situation where your software is so hard to use that the only way people can even stomach attempting it is through video. Now, people do love video still. The poll is indicative of that. Most people prefer video, but in many objective ways, it's pretty crappy and has quite a few downsides as a communication medium. First of all, compared to reading, it has pretty bad bandwidth. Omitting people who are of low literacy or have dyslexia, most people read faster than they listen. So you're talking about probably 90% of the population can read significantly faster than they can listen, especially compared to talking. So it's really listening, you can listen pretty quick. There's evidence that suggests that you can speed up conversations like 2 to 4x and you can still understand most of it. So the listening equipment actually pretty robust. It's the speaking equipment on the other end that's not quite that advanced. And so technically you could speed up those videos 2 to 4 times, but then all the movements and everything are sped up as well, so you're kind of losing some abilities there. But generally, you can read a lot faster. You can read something like 200 words per minute, whereas you can only listen at maybe half to a quarter of that, generally speaking. So generally, people read faster than they listen. You've also got, when you do a video, a single narrative structure. When you're writing something, you can easily fork off when there's a decision to be made. So if A, then we do this. If B, then we do this, right? If you're speaking and recording it, so it's in video form, then every time you fork off, you have to go on a tangent. And if you go on a tangent within a tangent, then you've probably lost everybody already. Just like I've lost all of you right now. Look at that irony. So if you go on a tangent within a tangent, then you've lost everybody already, and now everyone doesn't remember what we were talking about originally, which was a single narrative structure, because I went on too many tangents. If this was written, as it is, because I also made slides, then you would remember that we were talking about a single narrative structure, because you could refer back to the text. So in this case, the writing was very useful in supplementing the speaking part. You've also got very few troubleshooting options because of that. So if there's a step and something can go wrong at that step, the only way that you can communicate that is just to say it, which means that for 90% of people you're wasting their time, because most people want to counter a problem. So if there's a step where 10% of your user base encounters a problem, well, you still have to say it, otherwise you're omitting 10% of your population. That's annoying. That means that if you've got several such problems, and all of those different users don't overlap, so one group of users has problem A, one group of users has problem B, one group of users has problem C. If those all occur at, let's say, a 10% rate, first of all, something like 70% of your users, I'm not going to do the exact math, but something like 70% of users encounter no problems and had to hear all three of those things for no reason. And then obviously there's the groups that had problem A but not B and C that had to hear your explanation for B and C for no reason. It becomes very difficult very quickly to handle those troubleshooting options. Alternatively, you just don't address them. You address only the perfect case. That's a dangerous thing to do as well. Skipping around is really hard in a video. It's gotten a lot better over the years. Somebody mentioned the YouTube hover over timestamps and all those different things. Yes, those are great advancements. So this is less of a point today than it used to be, but we didn't always have where you could hover over the loading bar, progress bar on the bottom and see what the different parts of the video look like visually. That wasn't always a feature, so that's definitely improved this quite a bit. But it's still difficult. You still have to do quite a bit of seeking in order to find the part that you want, right? And seeking is a fairly long process, and it also has a fairly high cognitive burden, so the longer people are seeking your content, the more distracted they become, and the less they end up hearing of the actual content itself. And then, as I mentioned before, if you really want to make a high-quality tutorial, production becomes expensive very quickly. If you have to hire Jennifer Aniston and Matthew Perry, that's millions of dollars already, because they're widely successful on Friends. And if you want to go a little bit below that for your enterprise tutorial, even then, I mean, just the editing and all of that stuff already has raised your production costs beyond text. So if you're not just simply recording your screen and uploading it, if you're also editing, superimposing stuff on it, and doing audio, you're already in territory where you've probably gotten pretty close to the time cost it would have taken you to write it out. Talk about the Wadsworth Constant too. It's a funny meme. I love this meme. It's very true. It's that you can skip the first 30% of any video because it contains no worthwhile information. I've been following this for years. I just, whenever I click on some kind of tutorial to do anything, whether it's to do a kickflip or turn off my sprinkler or whatever, I just skip the first like 30% of it, and I've never, well, almost never seen that steer me wrong, right? And it's interesting because I'm giving you advice that would make that wrong, but hopefully one day we change the way that our videos are made and that we don't have to do that anymore. So try to be part of the generation that doesn't give the lengthy introductions and start every video off with, hey folks, today we're going to do sprinkler turn off. This is a very important thing that everybody loves. Like, comment, and subscribe. Come hang out in my live streams, and etc. Hopefully we at some point reach a point in our civilization where we don't have to do that anymore. Try to make it so that your users don't have to skip the first 30% of your video. If you're gonna do video, I'm not saying don't do video. It has its downside, but it also has its pros. Then make sure that you're focusing on your information per second. Try to make your video as dense as possible, because if people want to hear it again, it's not hard. So don't worry about giving them a lot of information quickly. They can always just listen to it again if they have to. Someone said take a long time pausing, and they're like, yeah, don't be afraid to pause and take a long time pausing and then say stuff. Also, if you're going to do video, a very difficult thing that people have a hard time with in presentations is pausing. And people have a tendency to ramble instead of pausing. It's true of almost everybody. The more you present, the more you do videos, the less this becomes something that you do. You should be comfortable with pausing. It's okay to use the occasional and but you definitely want to avoid those, right? Because they get annoying very quickly. They get noticeable very quickly. So you have to make sure that you're comfortable enough with pausing, not to not to ramble. Say what you're going to say, gather your thoughts. It's good to have a script, but then if you've made a script, you're already again at that production value level where you could have just written something, and that probably would have been better. Let's do some general guidelines real quick. First, always start by stating the topic. Tell people what they're going to do, what they're going to learn, what they're going to need, and how long it's going to take. So those last two are not always relevant. Sometimes what you need is pretty obvious, like if it's software, you need a computer, okay. But sometimes you do want to tell people like what operating system they're working on, what version you need, all that sort of stuff. If you're using software like Python or whatever, tell people what version you're using. It's really annoying when they just say get, well, let's just stay with Python. Get Python. Okay, which one? 2, 3, 3.5, 3.6, 3.7? I don't know what you did this on. If it's like 4 years later, I have no idea how to make this work. This tutorial describes the process for installing my crapware on Win 10. It should take about 5 minutes. That's a perfect statement of the topic. It's short. Don't take a long time stating the topic, because this is not a very important thing. This is just for users to look at and say, oh yeah, that's what I need to do, or that's not what I need to do. If they already know how to install crapware, then they know to skip this. Okay, if they're looking for how to use crapware, they can move on to another section, another tutorial. Additionally, if they don't have at least 5 minutes, they're going to move on to something else. Or, if they're impatient, they're going to look at this and go, oh, well, it takes 5 minutes. Well, that's all right then, I'll do it. Now, I've omitted the what you learn here in this statement because it's implicit. You're going to learn how to install crapware. So you don't have to state these things explicitly if they consume extra space. Again, be minimalistic. There's probably a way I could shorten this even further if you want to give it a go. This tutorial describes the process for installing crapware. I could probably just say, This tutorial will tell you how to install crapware on Win 10. It should take 5 minutes. You can omit even more words. That'd probably be even better. You haven't really lost anything by going that way. In this case, you know you need Win 10. That's the only thing that was relevant here. Now Windows 10 version numbers don't really matter because you can't really download a particular version of Windows. You can, but that's not a typical process that people go through. So in this case, you don't want to include the version numbers and stuff because it's not relevant. Aggressively divide your tutorial into sections. Include a lot of white space. A lot of people like to use numbered bullets. Numbered bullets are good. Make sure your steps are visually distinct and easy to scroll. You want people to be able to scroll and search quickly visually. One of the main advantages of text compared to video is its searchability. So the only way to achieve good searchability is good scrolling. One of my biggest pet peeves is when a tutorial spans multiple pages that require you to hit some kind of forward and back buttons. This is usually done as a dark pattern in order to get people to visit more pages to make your website more popular and therefore generate more AdSense revenue. But it is incredibly annoying and I just tend to avoid those entirely. Sometimes it's done for innocuous reasons or not nefarious reasons. In that case, don't do it. You're just being an idiot. Don't have forward and back buttons on your tutorial. Make the whole thing scrollable unless for some reason it's become unscrollable due to a system resources thing. But I don't know, how long does your PDF have to be before it can't be scrolled anymore? Probably thousands of pages. And keep your steps concise. Don't write a step that's a giant block of text and then another step that's another giant block of text. Try to split your steps into a couple of lines each and then a corresponding image, or even better, just the image. I say even better with the implication that the image is completely descriptive of what you need to do. So again, going back to that example where you go to File, Page Setup, it better show me all three of those things, and it better show me the mouse hovering in the right place, clicking on the right thing. Okay, and all of that needs to be very clearly defined for you to be able to say you don't need any accompanying text with this. But if you do have text with it, make sure you pair your image very closely to the text that references it. So if you're going to be nearing the end of the page and you don't have room, leave some blank space at the end of the page. Just go on to the next one. It's better to have the image and the text on the same page than to require a user to flip back and forth or scroll back and forth. When you hit a fork, so occasionally the user makes some kind of decision in your tutorial that leads to different paths. So in this case, you want to use your tools and hyperlink to the different possible paths. So you've got linking ability in any kind of software, pretty much, that you can write in. You can also link in video. A little bit harder on modern YouTube. They don't really have the whole thing floating in a box anymore, but you can give people links in the video descriptions to jump ahead. Link to the possible paths, as in if you're saving a file, click here. If you're loading a file, click here, and those two clicks should bring you to the part in the tutorial where you need to be. That brings us to the frequently asked questions, which are the main reason that you end up generating forks after you've written your tutorial. So as your tutorial is used or you test it on people, you probably discover issues, things you didn't address. Sometimes you can add those to your tutorial, but sometimes you can't, or it's not practical to rewrite it for any number of reasons. In this case, you want to provide a list of the common questions and their answers. You want to try to categorize the questions. You want to try to make your answers here as descriptive as they need to be in order to fully answer the question. Again, you might provide images. And then once you've developed a few questions and you've figured out where in the tutorial they tend to come up, you can link them in the tutorial. This is better than putting them within the tutorial for the most part, because not everybody will run into those issues. So it can be something like experiencing this issue, see here, experiencing this issue, see here, where you understand that the majority of your user base, so 80–90% of the people who are reading it, won't encounter any of those issues. Don't waste your space describing them. describe them elsewhere, and link to them for the people that do run into those issues. But every issue that you're aware of should hopefully be covered in your FAQ. So you probably want to, as you run into issues that you become aware of, generate these kind of Q&A format sections so that you can address all the different issues that come up. You should have a table of contents. Again, searchability, biggest advantage of text. Very important to your tutorial so that users who are more experienced and know what they want, they don't want to read the whole thing, they can jump to where they actually need to be. Again, you can use your tools. Table of contents can be auto-generated. Most of you guys did one for the last homework, but a lot of you use Sheets. Sheets as auto-generate is kind of meh. But the auto-generation in a variety of tools is acceptable. I guess Sheets is fine. Sometimes it breaks hyperlinks, but it's fine. Organizing your forks into a meaningful table of contents is really difficult, though. So consider some kind of, it wouldn't be a binary tree, it'd be something like a 3-4 tree, or, well, it'd be a tree. Not necessarily any number of leaves. You might have an arbitrary number of leaves from any particular node. So consider making some sort of visual tree-like organization of your tutorial. It's possible to have like a tree-like image in lieu of a table of contents if your tutorial is very tree-like or very graph-like. In some cases you have steps that lead to other steps and then back. So you have more of a graph structure than a tree. In that case, don't be afraid to have your table of contents in a graph form. Go to this step, if this, go to this step, if this, go to this step. You've probably seen these kinds of graphs, especially in like instruction manuals and stuff. If this goes wrong, go to this step. If this goes wrong, go to this step. That's a graph-like structure. It's much easier to follow if you have a picture. And remember that minimalism is not the same thing as ambiguity. So too much information is still better than not enough information. I haven't really mentioned that because I feel like it should be obvious that you still want to give people all the information that they need. Now, it's preferable to give them nothing more than what they need, but if you're not sure if the user needs some piece of information, don't err on the side of throwing it away, err on the side of including it. I know that's not necessarily minimalistic, but if you're not sure that they need something and you omit it, well, that can be much more frustrating than having an extra line in the tutorial. So minimalism is a skill that is learned until you have mastered it. Don't try to omit things too aggressively. Err on the side of including information rather than excluding it if you are not sure whether or not it's useful. And last, remember your audience again. Power users don't need their hands held, so if you're writing a tutorial for what you presume will be your power users, so if it's, let's say, an application for legal secretaries, give them all the information that they need, and don't assume that they need a hand-holdy, very light tutorial because this is their profession and it's something that they're going to use professionally and they're going to use it maybe a lot. In that case, you can be much more descriptive and much more in-depth than you would normally be for just an average consumer product. So know your audience. Not everybody needs the total minimalistic experience, and don't sacrifice your power users for the sake of no tutorial. So again, in that example, if you're making something for legal secretaries, a temptation to make it look flashy and simple is low because there's no reason for it to look flashy and simple. It's used for a professional in a professional environment. They will eventually learn to navigate the menus and the submenus and hopefully use all the keyboard shortcuts and stuff. People that are able to use an application well have so much knowledge that is memorized that required some sort of tutorialing. So they know all the different mnemonic keys, they know all the different arrow key combinations, right? So like you are probably to an extent with Eclipse at this point. You know how to navigate it very, very quickly in a way that is not at all intuitive, because Eclipse is not a piece of software that is intuitive in the least, And that's a good thing because it's feature rich. And all the tutorials for Eclipse are the same way. They are long and complicated. That's fine, because Eclipse is for professionals. And if you're not willing to read that much information for your profession, then maybe you shouldn't work in that profession. Maybe you should do something else. Now, if you're targeting the average user, think about the average user. They're the 50th percentile user. That means that everyone who's below average can't use your tutorial? Well, that sucks. But then at the same time, if you target the lowest common denominator, if you target, let's say, the 10th percentile user, well, now you probably alienate more of those people towards the top. So it's very difficult to strike that balance between something that the higher end, the people who are closer to the power user end of the spectrum, are able to have the patience for, while also keeping in mind those lower end of the spectrum folks that need a little bit more hand-holding. That's a very difficult balance to strike. One thing to mention is that sometimes the people on the higher end are able to skip the tutorial, and so addressing the tutorial to folks on the lower end may very well be a viable strategy. So just targeting the people who are the most likely to have issues may very well be a viable strategy. But for your senior design project, I think your audience is very clearly known, and there's not much of a case of averages. Most of the people that you are designing the software for are in a very specific and narrow set of skills. So whether they are in an administrative role in the office, or whether they're on the floor, or whether they're students, or whether they're instructors, those people all have really similar skills for the most part. So you probably know roughly what your audience is looking for. Just try to put yourself in their shoes. Okay, I think that's it for today. Got any questions on non-developer tutorials? Because if not, we're going to go hunt down some examples in our final 10 minutes here. If anybody has any ideas for a tutorial they want to see, I will pull that up. And since we're looking for not developer tutorials, I'm going to look at not software. So let's go with how to cook pot pie first. Pillsbury. Pillsbury is a major company. They should be able to give me a wonderful tutorial. Okay. They've opened with something of a story. One of our most popular and top-rated meals of all time. The classic pot pie. This classic pot pie recipe has a flaky, buttery crust and a creamy sauce. Every recipe has to open with one of these, right? The hook. The hook is the flakiness, the butteriness, the creaminess, etc. Lovely. Okay. What did they tell you first? Boy, this website has a lot of stuff getting ad blocked. What did they tell you first? Well, they tell you what you need, which is good, right? So they tell you your ingredients. Usually they tell you how long it takes. Oh, there we go, prep time, hour time. You should do the same thing for your tutorials. Have a what you need ingredients type section if that's relevant, and then a how long is it going to take type section if that's relevant. They also tell you how many servings you're going to make. So what you're going to get 6 classic pot pies exactly if you follow these steps. Lovely. Now I know everything. So if I want classic pot pies, I will proceed from here, and in this case I do. All right. Prevent your screen from going dark while you cook. That doesn't seem like it's part of the recipe, does it? So that's some extra information from them trying to get me to click on whatever crapware they have on their website. Heat your oven to 425. Lovely. Prepare pie crusts as directed on the box for 2 pie crusts using 9-inch glass pie pans. So that is a reference to a box that is not pictured here, because there are many different kinds of box and there are many different kinds of pie crust. So pet peeve of mine at software tutorials as well, to use this kind of cop-out. It's very annoying. If you need, let's say, multiple software dependencies to get something running. So let's say I have crapware A and you need vaporware B, in order to get it running. Let's imagine that we had a similar instruction. Prepare vaporware B according to the instructions on vaporware B's installation page. I don't want to go to vaporware B's installation page. I want you to tell me how to install it. I'm already here. I don't have to go to all these different places and open a bunch of tabs. So if possible, walk people through the whole thing. Don't be Pillsbury here. Don't reference the back of the box. Okay, tell them what to do. Now in this case, lots of different pie crust boxes that you could be referencing, so they really can't give you a specific instruction here. But in the case of software, I think you usually can. Now the alternative is you have, let's say, software that runs on different systems, and you say something like, prepare your whatever in the standard of your system. Okay, that's fine, all right, if there are many different ways for it to happen, but I would prefer that you give me an example. So if it's like, open this in your favorite text editor, well, give me the one that you used for this tutorial. Show me what system you did it on at least. So at least I have one example. And if I can't get it working, what I will do is I will default to the way you did it. And I'll try to do it on your system. In 2-quart saucepan, melt butter over medium heat. What is medium heat? No one ever tells you that. What's medium heat? I have an electric oven. It goes from 0 to 10. So is medium heat 5? Because 5 will incinerate anything I put on it in like seconds. Especially butter. It'll turn black in like 30 seconds. So they probably didn't really mean medium heat for electric oven users. Another pet peeve in computering as well. Different kinds of users, different kinds of machines. You use variable references like that, like medium heat. Everyone's conception of medium heat is a little bit different. At the same time, if they gave you the exact temperature, well, most people don't walk around the kitchen with an IR thermometer. And if they gave you the dial setting for my electric oven, so mine melts butter at around 2 or 3 without burning it, well, that obviously wouldn't work for your ovens. So what can you do? What's an easier, more common way to say melt butter over medium heat that is more universally applicable and more indicative of what they actually want you to do? What's a better way to phrase this than just medium heat? Any ideas? What's better than medium heat? Add onion, cook 2 minutes, stirring frequently until tender. Stir in flour, salt, and pepper. Tell them the only oven that this works with. So give an example oven. Doesn't work too well for ovens, right? So it would be like saying what model of computer you used. It's not an option for a better tutorial to just get a new computer. If it doesn't work, I did this on a Dell Optiplex 47A. Oh, well, if it didn't work, I guess I got to go buy a Dell Optiplex 47. It doesn't really make sense in that case. So there's no good answer for how to communicate the heat that is medium heat that was intended here. But let's try. How do you better communicate that? Add onions, cook 2 minutes, stirring frequently until tender. Stir in flour, salt, and pepper until well blended. Again, well blended is a difficult concept. I think most people probably understand what well blended means. Gradually stir in broth and milk, cooking and stirring until bubbly and thickened. What if it doesn't turn bubbly? What if it just turns black? Have I made a mistake? Is this one of those situations where there needs to be a fork? What if it turned black? They showed me one picture, so I know roughly what it's supposed to look like at this stage. Someone said heat until melted if we're talking about butter. Okay, well, I can melt butter by leaving it out at room temperature long enough. It's not quite medium heat as intended. I would say medium heat is something like set your butter in a saucepan to the highest heat that doesn't burn it. Something like that would be closer to the intent, I imagine. But it is a very difficult concept to communicate. I think you run into a lot of similar concepts in software. Concepts that are very difficult to communicate because they vary wildly by people's setups and machines and everything. Alright, it's all the time we have for today. I'm sorry we didn't get through the whole pot pie recipe. Obviously, we'll spend at least the next few classes going through that. I'll see you guys in 15 minutes in senior design. And no, I'm not serious about the pot pie thing. Okay. Adios. You know what? I don't want to end on the pot pie because that'll become my thumbnail. I'm gonna end on this. Okay, guys, thanks for tuning in.